In one of his books, Michael Paternity shares a supposedly true but almost unbelievable story he heard when visiting his father's ancestral village in Sicily. Michael saw a very old woman slowly walking through the town with her cane every day he was in the village. The woman would struggle to make her way up a steep road so that she could get to the local cemetery. Michael was told that it took the woman around 6 hours to walk from her home to the cemetery and back every day. What could possibly motivate someone to make such a grueling, time-consuming journey on a daily basis? Maybe I could imagine it was an immeasurable love towards someone special she had lost, or maybe a deep desire to honor someone who had made a meaningful impact on her life. But it wasn't either of those things. It was quite the opposite. The local villagers told Michael that she was driven by ostio, the Italian word for bitter hatred. Her arch enemy was buried in that cemetery, so rain or shine, the elderly woman supposedly walked up that hill every day to her enemy's gravesite just to spit on it one more time. This woman clung so tightly to the hatred and bitterness she had toward another person that it consumed an unbelievable portion of her life. She was held captive in a prison of unforgiveness. I wonder what the other person did to this woman to embitter her so severely. I presume it was something that caused substantial pain and suffering in her life. And if it was, what should we tell this woman? Should we flippantly tell her that she just needs to forgive and forget? Should we imply that the suffering she experienced wasn't a big deal and she should just get over it? Or alternatively, should we tell her that hatred is justified and that she should continue to allow her bitterness to consume her and hold her captive? Should we imply that hatred and revenge are an acceptable response to the hurt she's experienced? What should we tell this woman, or better yet, what should we tell ourselves when we've been deeply wounded by another? I'm so glad you've joined us this week because we're going to dive into a topic that all of us wrestle with on a daily basis. We're going to discuss what it means and what it doesn't mean to forgive someone who has hurt us. You're watching One Day Closer, where we're learning together how to use our one day closer to eternity to bring hope and purpose to many. Let's go meet our guest for today. We're here today with Jessica Meade. Jessica, it's so great to have you back. Our first repeat guest, a counselor with Foundations Christian Counseling, and here to talk more about forgiveness. Yeah. So last episode, we talked about anxiety, and I encourage others to check that out if they haven't seen that. And then this week, just another very important topic for us. So for those who didn't see the previous episode, could you just share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm married for almost 17 years. Right. I did have to break out the calculator. We have 3 kids. Anna is 14, Lily is nearly 12, and Danny is almost 8.
Wow, and very.
Very. He's got the days counting down.
That's great.
So we enjoy spending time together and being outside and doing things as a family.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And as we talk about this topic of forgiveness, in our Christian culture today, what would you say is kind of maybe a typical view of forgiveness?
Yeah, I hear a lot that people say, well, I just have to forgive. Mm-hmm. And I say, well, why do you have to forgive? Well, because God forgave us. Mm. And I'm like, well, yeah, He did, which is wonderful, but I think it's just not that simple. And yes, we're so glad and that God has stepped down and has offered forgiveness to us, but we're not God.
Yeah, and you see this a lot in your counseling. I'm sure this is a deep issue that people wrestle with.
Absolutely.
What do we do when we're deeply wounded by another person? Mm-hmm. And what does it look like to forgive? I've found that it's helpful sometimes when we're defining something to define what it's not. Yeah. And so let's talk through some of the things that forgiveness is not.
Yeah, I actually think that's the important part here is talking about what forgiveness is not. And forgiveness is not forgetting. There's an importance in remembering well, remembering events wisely, accurately, and honestly.
Yeah.
Emotions get in the way, and sometimes those things get skewed.
Why would it be important to remember things? I love how you phrase that, well, wisely, and accurately. Why is that important for us to not just forget and try and push that aside?
It doesn't work. And I see people in my office all the time that try to put it away and like pretend like it didn't happen. And then it starts to come out in sideways kind of events and instances in the way people talk. And we can't just forget, and we can't just pretend like something didn't happen.
Yeah, just pretending. And so forgiveness is not forgetting. And you just said it's not pretending.
Right.
Not pretending that we're not hurt.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah. When somebody has wronged us, if we've been betrayed, if, just being hurt by others intentionally or unintentionally, there's hurt that comes with that. And when we pretend like that is not the reality of it, it invalidates our own experience. It messes with the scales a little bit. Yeah. Things don't have to be equal, but we can't push aside the fact that we have been hurt in what has happened.
Yeah, there's maybe a dissonance between what we've experienced and the reality of it, and then we're trying to have this kind of false idea of what it is and mask over it, and it's not dealing with the real pain there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What else? What else isn't forgiveness?
It is not just letting something go. I hear people say, well, give me a couple of weeks, I'll just move past it, it won't be a big deal. But Brad Hambrick, in his book, Making Sense of Forgiveness, which is an excellent read, he says, we overlook quirks, mistakes are excused, and sins are forgiven. And so there's this continuum of things that we have to be mindful of. We can be quirky as humans, and it might annoy somebody. Well, that's not necessarily something that has to be forgiven. We can overlook quirkiness. Mistakes, ask for forgiveness, but that's not entirely what we're talking about here. We're talking about these sins that are committed against us. That we have to, what do we do with that? Yeah,
and I know that whole letting it go thing. The next similar experience or argument, at least in my life, it's right there to come back. So if it's not forgiven,
absolutely,
letting go, maybe people are better at that than me, but I hear there's a lot of people struggling. Good. This is great. We're going to take a quick break. Then thank you. Stay with us. We're going to come back and hear more about what forgiveness isn't and what it is.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website, lighthousetv.org, for more information.
Welcome back. You're watching One Day Closer, and we're here with Jessica Meade, a counselor who's talking to us about forgiveness. So Jess, as we went to the break, we were just in the middle of talking about what isn't forgiveness? I think we have a lot of misunderstandings. So could you share, I think you have a couple more things we could talk about.
This is maybe one of the most important things. Forgiveness is not the removal of consequences. There are consequences to actions, to behaviors. Forgiveness doesn't mean that there's not consequences.
Yeah. So we can, there are things that happen in our lives, and there are repercussions, and maybe our relationship, the way that we relate to someone might be different.
Absolutely. And maybe it has to be.
Yeah. And how does that relate to trust?
I was going to say that rolls right into the next point. Forgiveness is not necessarily trust, and it's not necessarily reconciliation. We can't go on as if nothing has ever happened. And again, it's not out of necessarily a punishment, but like you said, there's repercussions to things that have happened, and we have to kind of just embrace that. Yeah.
And it's interesting as we think about these topics, my first thought in the pastoral background is, where do we see this biblically? And we see, and it's kind of interesting, and I was looking at it in Acts 9:26, when the Apostle Paul comes to the believers in Jerusalem for the first time, and it says they don't really trust him because, a very good reason, he was killing Christians. So, until Barnabas would vouch for him. And then this verse has always kind of captivated me, but until we're talking about the show, it really stuck out to me in John 2:23 through 25. It says that people saw Jesus' miracles and they believed in him. But then it says, but Jesus didn't entrust himself to them because he knows what's in the heart of a man. So it was a superficial belief. So even we see that in Jesus, there's a wisdom in how the trust comes about.
Absolutely. I love that.
What are your thoughts on how giving trust to another relates to their trustworthiness.
Sure. So trust is not all or nothing. You don't just have trust or you don't just not have trust. It's a spectrum. And so I like the idea of proportional value. So it's good to trust people at their level of trustworthiness. And so if you have a friend and that friend has been 50% trustworthy, it is foolish to give them 100% of your trust. And so it's using wisdom, and it's kind of like a trustworthiness scale, if you will. And not that we are qualifying people, but we have to be mindful of track record and, what has happened in the past. What is their level of trustworthiness?
Yeah. I love the idea of, I just love the word wisdom, right? We see it in the Bible, and I think for me it's helped a lot because I often think in terms of should and shouldn't, and I really like rephrasing that to what's the wise thing to do here? Because wisdom takes into consideration all of who God is, what He's created the world to be, and how our relationships maybe should function, instead of just, I should forgive.
Right.
Okay, but yes, I should forgive, but how do I wisely do that? And what does that look like? What, as we talk about forgiveness, what would be a quick, how would you phrase forgiveness if I said, what's forgiveness?
I think forgiveness is canceling a debt.
Yeah, that's great. And I love, as I was looking at the original language in the Bible behind forgiveness and how Jesus uses it, to release from legal or moral obligation or consequence. It's so powerful to cancel, remit, or pardon, like you just said. Canceling a debt, that's hard.
It's so hard.
When someone hurts me, to release them from the consequence, that's a really hard thing to do.
It's a very hard thing to do.
Do you find that many people that you counsel struggle with that in different ways? Or?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think it's our human nature.
Yeah. Revenge is the Lord's. Right? That's a hard one.
Absolutely.
Hard one to accept.
It is. It is, because we have a strong sense of justice. Or some people have stronger senses of justice than others. But we feel like justice should be served. And it's very difficult when it's not, or we don't see that justice. It's not, and I often, with my sons, and I think any children, they could say that's not fair becomes a very common restraint. And I've gone through something, kind of a saying I do with the boys, and it's, if they say it's not fair, then I say, okay, is life fair? They say no, and I say, why not? And they say, because God gives us grace. I said, what would happen if life were fair? We'd all be separated from God for eternity in hell. So, but does that mean that things won't be fair at some point? No, God's going to restore all that, right? And so I think it's hard to process through, because we do, God is a just God. But we live in this space right now where we have to try and manage and understand that. Absolutely.
When I was looking in the Bible dictionary about a definition for forgiveness, we talked about canceling a debt, and they give a second part to that. The effect of forgiveness is the restoration of both parties to the former state of relationship. So I agree with that, but I think there's some ways to maybe nuance that. How would you talk about this idea of restoring the relationship to a former state? Right.
So I think I don't know, maybe it's semantics I kind of get caught up in. And so we want to make sure that we're not using the terms restoration and reconciliation interchangeably. They're not the same things. And so I sometimes like to think about it more in terms of redemption. How can God redeem this relationship? Because that's really what we're talking about here as far as forgiveness is relationship. And so instead of restoration, which could maybe not be a good thing, if things weren't good before, do we really want to restore what that was, or do we want to redeem it and make it something, beauty from ashes, if you will? And so, I don't know, that's kind of how I like to look at it. And when I use those words in counseling, people are like, oh, I've been using them interchangeably. And it's kind of just a mindset.
And even theologically, it's different, right? They're different words that represent different meanings. And as I was looking kind of at the idea of restoration, because it is used in the Bible, one sense in Acts 3:21, it's talks about Jesus will be in heaven until he comes to restore all things,
Yes.
right? So there's a restoration to how God has designed creation,
Yeah.
but it's going to be different than the garden before the fall,
Right.
So it's not just the same thing; it's similar but better.
Yes.
And then the Galatians 6:1, if people are caught in sin, we as believers are to go and restore them gently.
Yep.
Right. And I found it really interesting when I looked at the definition of the word that's used for restore in that context. And it's to cause to be in a condition to function well. And so that's really interesting, right? There's a lot of wisdom, I think, in that as we're looking at restoration, or as you're saying, redeeming what has happened to get to a better place.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's exciting.
It is.
And what, as we talk about reconciliation, you talked about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Definition I found talks about restoring harmony.
I love
that. Right? That's so good.
I love it.
Harmony is just such a great word.
Yes, it is.
What does it look like to restore something, a broken relationship through forgiveness, to function well and to restore harmony? How would you kind of talk about that?
I mean, there can be forgiveness even without trust. And so I'm thinking about it a little bit like that. Like harmony, again, I love that word. It just reminds me of music and that everything's flowing together nicely.
Yes.
Well, sometimes that doesn't really happen.
Yeah.
And so what does that look like? And can you have harmony without trust? I think you can, but that doesn't mean you have given full access to the other person who has wronged you, who needs that forgiveness. And so like the debt of forgiveness can be forgiven without trust and confidence, or even reliability being part of the equation.
Yeah. Do you have any tangible examples or thoughts on what does that look like? What does it look like to forgive someone but not fully trust them immediately?
And so I'm trying to think of a real world example.
Yeah.
And, I think in cases maybe with like infidelity in a marriage, I think that's just a really clear, even if you're going to work on the marriage and pray and hope that God redeems it, that doesn't mean that the trust is 100% reinstated. Maybe there's things that have to be done differently to establish trust. Trust takes time. Trust takes reliability. It takes, you're going to do what you said you're going to do. And I can see that you are being reliable and like earning that trust back. And so, but you can still function day to day. You pick up the kids, I'm going to go to the grocery store, we're going to eat dinner together. You can still function in harmony, but that doesn't mean that trust has been restored yet.
Yeah, that's the desire and the goal, right? But there's been a significant offense, and that requires maybe more wisdom in how that's approached.
Yeah.
And what would you say about just the goal of forgiveness? What should we strive towards in forgiveness?
I think the goal is to resist defining the offender by their offense.
Oh, come on now. You're making this hard.
I know. And so, and I think it's even when it's not things that have been offensive to us, even on behalf of other people. I think there's the real risk of being like, they're just a cheater.
Yeah.
They're just fill in the blank. We do this as humans all the time. But I think the goal of forgiveness is to get away from that and to not define the person by their actions.
How do we define them? Then what helps us see beyond this person is what they do, what they have done?
I don't want people to see me by only my actions. I want them to see me as a person, that I'm more than just my job or as a mom or just as a wife. And so I think it's looking at the person. Are they 100% bad? Maybe. But I would argue to say that No, they probably aren't. And so it's not defining them by that, but it's being mindful of it. We're not ignoring it. We're not pretending like it didn't happen or pushing it aside, but that's not their definition.
Yeah.
They are a child of God.
Yeah.
And we have to see each other as such.
Yeah. And they're a human being created in the image of God.
Absolutely.
Right. With the ability and responsibility to reflect the goodness and greatness of God.
Yes.
In a way that no other aspect of creation can do.
Absolutely.
I was reading, once again, I'm going back because I want to be clear as we talk about this in the Bible dictionary, but the same word is used in the New Testament for faith, belief, trust. It's all one word. And in Paul's letters, it says faith is trust in Jesus, his teaching, and his redemptive work, because we talk about redemption. And as a result, a total submission to him and his message. So I found it really interesting to think about the idea that we can forgive someone without fully trusting them because we can fully trust Jesus.
Absolutely.
Right? How exciting is that?
It's amazing. Because really, forgiveness doesn't make sense if you take it outside of the cross and what Jesus did for us.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense at all. And so that is where we have to look.
That's our example. Well, that's a great place to end our conversation. Thank you so much, Jess.
Thank you.
Stay tuned. We're going to be back to talk about how can we apply this to our lives and relationships.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device or go to our website, lighthousetv.org, for more information.
Jesus gives us some very clear and simple instructions about forgiveness. In Luke 17, 2-3, Jesus tells his disciples to forgive over and over and over again as much as those who have sinned against them repent and seek forgiveness. In Matthew 6:14-15, Jesus tells his disciples that their experience of forgiveness in their relationship with God is directly related to their willingness to forgive those who have sinned against them. Forgiveness isn't an option for followers of Jesus. Because our Heavenly Father has forgiven us so radically, we should also provide radical forgiveness to those who have deeply offended us. However, although the command to forgive is clear and simple, the act of forgiving another person should not be made overly simplistic. God has made us complex human beings, a marvelous and wonderful intertwining of body, soul, and spirit. All our unique life experiences, our personalities, our joys and sorrows, all somehow meld together in a way that influences how we process the offenses we experience and how we learn to express forgiveness. So let's not minimize the complexities of learning to forgive as a broken and sinful human being in a fallen world, but let us also maximize the priceless, gracious forgiveness God has lavished on us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Let us be a people who are so captivated by the love of Jesus and so surrendered to the leading of the Holy Spirit that we fight to get to a place where we can wisely and fully offer genuine forgiveness to those who have offended us, even in the deepest ways. Here are some steps you can take to begin moving toward freedom-giving forgiveness tomorrow. First, get alone with God right now and ask him two things. Say, Father, please give me your heart towards those who have offended me. And please show me if I am withholding forgiveness from someone in my life who is seeking reconciliation. Second, I want you to write down the name of this person that God brings to your mind along with these two prayers. Jesus, help me to forgive this person as you have forgiven me. And Jesus, help me to fully trust you and give me wisdom to know the extent to which I should trust this person. Third, I want you to ask yourself, what is the next smallest step I can take this week to begin moving toward reconciliation with this person? Remember, tomorrow is a new day. It's a blank page with nothing yet written on it. When the sun rises on that new day, what story of forgiveness will you be writing? Whatever that story is, I would love to hear about it. Please go to onedaycloser.tv and share your victories and difficulties with me. I'd love to celebrate with you and pray for you. Thank you so much for joining us to One Day Closer, where we're learning together how to use our one day closer to eternity to bring Jesus-infused hope and purpose to many.